Hello, I'm Marc Roux, chair of the Association Française Transhumaniste Technoprog, and I will present in the first part the particular understanding of transhumanism as members of this association, and I'll give you an overview of our key ethical and political positions. And in the second part, I will discuss various proposals that we are moving today to consider a techno-progressive future. First, some general reminders. In our opinion, there is not one transhumanism, but some transhumanisms. Indeed, the problems concern all the cultural and political fields. In the previous graphic, you can see that the field of biopolitics is perpendicular to classical politics. And so you can have really a lot of different interpretation of transhumanism from really conservative to really progressist. And personally, I know some transhumanists that's claiming that they are from far left to far right. So I would argue that it is precisely the multiplicity of transhumanist thought that proves how much it is alive and successful. That said, there is still points on which we transhumanists often agree, regardless of our tendencies. The first question to ask is, what is human? Not necessarily answering the question, transhumanists believe above all that the human condition is a moving condition. From our point of view, essentially materialist, humans today is the result of a process of evolution of life over millions of years since the appearance of the species. There is no evidence that this process is completed, even if the condition in which it operates have changed. In other words, the man of today is not the man of tomorrow, and it's not the man of yesterday. Yet all these men are humans. And this is an important point for issues such as dignity and respect, or what make a being is considered a person of law. The spectacular development of science and technology, called the NBIC convergence, could help lead or guide the development of individual and species. This chosen evolution, as opposed to the suffered evolution animals and plants, would eventually result in a movement that began at least to the Renaissance, and which, far from being fundamentally new, would allow to go up a scale. Let us be clear, transhumanism is less rupture than continuity. This obviously does not mean that we all understand and master the complexity of life, far from it. But we, humans, are beginning to be able to intervene in this process, and every indication shows that this is only the beginning. It seems likely that humanity will learn to control more and more its own biological destiny. Sure, some say, if not destroying itself before. But why? What do we do with humans? This fundamental question is asked at this point for all of us and makes absolutely necessary the wider debate. Do we intervene only at minimum, staying as close as possible to a therapeutic approach, accompanying an evolution that, if it's already since long determined only more by the only natural selection, will predominantly remain related to changes in our environment? Or do we assume our knowledge, the legacy of the history of human thought? And shall we go forward? And if so, under what conditions can we consider intervening more heavily to go behind the care to offer a true enhancement of individuals or the species? But more important of any other question is the question why? To do what and for which reasons? This raises a host of other issues, the one calling the other. What is really an enhancement, an improvement? What really matters, which will change the face of humanity? Is this or that improvement useful for the individual? Will be for the species? What direction could take these actions? What dangers could arise? And so on. So far, the public was not interested in all this. It's mainly the elite, political, economics, or even scientific, that have taken over these issues. In France, it's only very recently that it's a matter of real public debate about all that. For example, the former national debate about nanotechnology. Thus, the phenomenal success of a video game 1.5 years ago, like Deus Ex, Human Revolution, this did much to break the circle of elite debate. The fact that it was a mature view on the issue has much to do. But while some promise a bright future to it, I think, for example, to the essay by Laurent Alexandre, La mort de la mort. This debate here is still in its infancy. However, it appears that the choices made by decision makers are guided by a deep conservatism. Whether it's the votes cast 2 years ago by the French national representation in connection with the revision of the bioethics laws, or the previous recommendations of the National Advisory Board of the Ethics, CCNE, when we touch the bottom of the reasons given, it always comes the same conclusion. Don't touch the taboo of what is alive. And it seems that we are just now witnessing the same phenomenon around the issue of medically assisted procreation, whose generalization is one of the issues of the mariage pour tous, marriage for all. From the point of view of transhumanism, it's time to break free of such shackles, particularly because there are values that we feel more important, even more important than the living. There will be the conscious thinking. Whether you are a biologist or a young mother, we are all fascinated by the miracle of life. This group of cells that is struggling to continue to exist against all odds is a miracle. And yet, even more than this living which is satisfied itself to be, what is important to the human is the higher consciousness, the conscious thoughts which, not content to be, on the contrary, want to exist. It is science, especially the latest advances in cognitive science, that make me say that human thought is that the living has developed more powerful on this planet to control the environment and anticipate the future. But it's a transhumanist thought that led me to say that today this conscious thought could serve its emergence independently, not be the product of the living, but the product of itself. It could be largely free itself from the fragility of original biological living. It could be by better connecting it to better learn how it works, and thus be better able to integrate neurostructural mechanisms that will allow us one day, to us humans, no longer subject to its dictates, but to participate with it in our own destiny, that we will write freely in conscience. The thought, conscience or not, moreover, seems to me now take a major part in making our reasons for living. Since at the higher consciousness, we are not anymore guided only by a biological imperative, instinctive for survival. We depend ever more on the meaning we give to our own lives. But what does make us able to find or invent a meaning to our lives if it's not the conscious thought? Imagine an earth having lost all trace of life may seem a terrible desolation, but a universe having lost all traces of human thought. Jean-Paul Sartre expresses in his autobiography, Les Mots, that this idea inspired to him one of its greatest terrors. It is an abyss without any hope, and personally I refuse to imagine. And post-human or pro-extraterrestrial assumptions or those of deep ecology which will put the destiny of thought or of life in the hands of beings or systems having nothing to do with humans, in my opinion, do not eliminate this fear. I really doubt they may one day anonymously, or even that they win any votes. The search for a continuation of conscious thoughts of human origin in exchange seems to me a maybe target of universal range. But before we get there, before freeing the mind, it is first question for most transhumanists to release the individual more and more. In my opinion, one of the values shared by most transhumanists is inherited from the Enlightenment. The free disposal of his body is inalienable as long as it does not affect the freedom of others. The result is a multiplicity of demands that society, and rather the state, particularly in France, still persist in refusing. I will return later in detail. However, before explaining what the French Association of Transhumanists may make as techno-progressive proposals, I have to take two final precautions. Several major obstacles stand in the way of the path of successful transhumanism. These pitfalls are quite clearly identified by those who claim techno-progressivism. One of the most dangerous, if not worst, is that arising from the excesses of market logic as governing our dominant system, particularly the last 2 or 3 centuries. In our day, these logics, aren't they trending toward the privatization of all knowledge and even of living? The growing concentration of capital and economic power causes excessive social inequalities, doesn't it? I think we need to take seriously the neo-Luddites' warning when they argue that in a system so unequal, any technological advance can only serve to reinforce inequalities. The techno-progressives refuse the logic of absolute capital concentration because it seems to them it carries a risk that could be fatal to transhumanism itself. That a majority of people increasingly refuse the use of certain scientists' advance. Beyond even such a blockage, the destabilization caused in our society by a level of extreme inequality, and history has shown profusely, can lead to disorders sufficient to cause their collapse. Another aspect of the same pitfall is the consumerist logic. In a system where one of the main purposes is to increase the capital, the accumulation machine needing more and more goods and service consumption, some of the players are constantly seeking the best possible control of the economic behavior of consumers. It seems, for example, that the advertising companies are the largest center of private investment in current cognitive science. Many already today swear only by the magic, even luckily plot, of the neuromarketing. For them, it sometimes seems that the ideal transhuman will be a consumer at orders. But beyond the danger that such a prospect poses to our freedoms, this logic seems to me that deadly because it's based on the merits of a principle of irresponsibility, the idea that all property and all resources can be privatized and consumed indefinitely. It denies the notion of commons and will prefer to deny the idea that our planet, and thus humanity for a long time, has limitation. It only has to see that the difficulty with which the system reacts to the climate crisis. Major economic interest prevents states agree on urgent measures to be taken. From this perspective, the transhumanism ideas of human enhancement could result in an demultiplied augmentation of consumption and precipitating our absurd rush headlong toward the wall of ecological constraints. Thus, techno-progressives, perhaps unlike other proponents of transhumanism, want to pay attention to improving the social and ecological environment they consider necessary for the human thought, or even what this will become. Another well-known problem, and maybe equally important, is to trust in the technical progress that borders on religious faith, that science will solve our problems. From the perspective of the French Association of Transhumanists, it goes without saying that every technical progress that brings hopes and at the same time brings risks. We, the people and humanity, have already paid expensively for the use or rush development of certain technology. Say, to only mention the 20th centuries, that's nuclear weapons or asbestos. If we want to seriously consider the use and development of technologies that can powerfully transform the condition, not only social, but also biological, of humans, then certainly there are risks that we should learn to minimize. For in the potential of some technologies of human enhancement probably lie what is sometimes called the existential risks in a global sense. That is to say that the possibility of endangering the very existence of humanity, loss of control of a super virus, creating an hostile artificial intelligence, nanoparticle pollution, or a drastic increase in lifespan resulting in a drop of procreation, or a combination of various technological disaster, ecological and social. Therefore, techno-progressive transhumanists wants to be more than particularly attentive to the risks, even at the forefront about the dangers that their anticipations sometimes make them alone to get a glimpse. And they don't reject a precautionary principle, principe de précaution, even registered in the Constitution, as is the case in France. And that will be used rationally and responsibly. That is to say, not to turn a blind eye or to allow politicians to discharge their responsibilities, but to support technological progress and ensure that it is simply in the direction of human progress. Thus, transhumanist thought advances maybe more every day, some might say inexorably, in the direction of an action of a political nature. But in France, where are we? To answer for now, I propose to begin to tell you in my second part that the proposals of techno-progressivism can be. For over 2 years, the French Transhumanist Association began work that aims to create a program of demands. This should apply to the whole of society in general and politicians in particular. At this stage, it's still underdeveloped and focuses only on 4 areas which we consider paramount. The more global, the more specific, the fundamental freedoms, social questions, education, and research. In the area of freedom, we want at this stage to emphasize the need to expand individual freedoms, and especially the freedom to dispose of our own body. Western societies have undoubtedly become very liberal in terms of morality, if we measure the scale of history. Say a century from the roaring 20s, our societies have generally continued to allow more individual emancipation. Yet, it seems there is still work to do, as many were the laces of the social corsets surrounding us from the beginning. We are still prisoners of many taboos. One of the main claims of world transhumanism from, for example, Donna Haraway and the Cyborg Manifesto in 1991 is that of freedom as widely as possible as to the use, processing or enhancement of one's body. It is significant that the prospect of cyborg organism was used by the American philosopher as a means of promoting women's liberation. The emancipation of women is still incomplete, and a radical freedom to dispose of our body can be a powerful way to advance this cause. I will come back to it. But without going immediately to the cyborg, The transhumanism believed that society and the state should intervene as little as possible in front of the responsibility for choice of individuals, but also the parents or future parents about the use of the body. Concerning the predetermination or modification of genetic characteristics, for example, as long as it doesn't produce overt social disorder, we do not see how the community can justify a ban in principle. The arguments, such as those derived from the reaction of the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, justifying the ban on the grounds of deprivation of an essential indeterminacy of the individual and necessary for the construction of his personality and freedom. These arguments, therefore, seem purely speculative. They are based, and for good reason, on any findings. And they are certainly more dependent of an old fair inspired by deep religious feelings. Do not play God. And in the facts, the social determinations, which they have always existed, seem much heavier than any genetic determination. But this, unfortunately, the society adapts to it every day. But let's talk specifics. Now I want to highlight two examples and very current practices that are nowadays prohibited by French law, and we believe they should, as soon as possible, be made to the discretion of each. I will cite the case of surrogacy, in French la gestation pour autrui, and the use of psychoactive substances. Surrogacy, or GPA in French. It's not, strictly speaking, an enhancement in human. One might therefore ask what it has to do in a program of transhumanist demands. It seems, however, that it is fully participating in the same logic that can allow us to make us as independent as possible, if not the more master of our own body. As part of a relationship between consenting and in-charge adults, the voluntary and free provision of function of reproduction has not as inevitable consequence, far away from that, the difficulties in the development of the future child. On the contrary, in the context of a society that has accepted and well integrated this possibility of procreation, the surrogacy should not cause more problems than adoption. The French Transhumanist Association also takes part in more general movements of all those who seek liberalization and decriminalization for personal use of psychoactive substances. But for our purposes, it's not so much of what is considered drug, rather than any production of the pharmacopoeia, scientific or traditional, which can yield improved state of arousal, concentration, memory, imagination, etc. While acknowledging the obvious dangers associated with risk of addiction or harmful effects of substances that remain to be avoided, the transhumanist advocates for greater freedom and greater respect for the responsibility of the users. In the international transhumanist nebula, the French Transhumanist Association, Technoprog, as this is unique that it is the only organization I know to call openly to a techno-progressive. That is to say, not only a desire to encourage technological progress, but much more to put this one at the service of a progressivism in the sense of a collective human progress. Indeed, what will a society in which the enhancements in biological or cybernetics will be restricted to a minority of rich wealthy? The fears of an humanity to develop two or more speeds in which the equal rights of individuals will be questioned are justified. This is why our association claims that front of the model often presented a libertarian transhumanism that will benefit only the ruling classes. Another transhumanism is possible, concerned that one to give access to the larger many, if not to all, to the technologies of the enhancement. To ensure the widespread availability, it seems essential to be implemented strong policies of redistribution. One of the cornerstones shall be, in our opinion, the establishment of a universal income to good level. This concern for formal equality, it's the necessary requirement of our individual freedom, because we know that there is no real freedom without guaranteeing to all the minimum means to live that freedom. But our techno-progressive approach is not limited to a concern for greater equality. It also involves attention to major social balance. It's obvious that evolution of transhumanist type of our societies will result, in fact it already results, by tensions, misunderstandings, perhaps by opposition strong enough to produce major disturbances. It will be irresponsible to promote a transhumanism deaf to squeaks and cries of society. On the contrary, the French Transhumanist Association, Technoprog, consider that we may have transhumanism only from the wider debate. Its members are constantly seeking this debate and possibly promote and organize it. I have to propose that the issues of transhumanism are subject to multiplied debates at all levels of society, that as much as possible information is made available to as many of the most dispassionate, so that everyone can form an opinion with full knowledge of the facts. In our modern time, or postmodern, the Internet global web occupy now an inescapable place. The news of last year's, I think especially the Arab Revolution, have shown strikingly to those who still doubt how it could be a factor in the democratic life. That's why EAFT joins those who require universal access to the Internet. This access must be guaranteed the same way as any utility access. Ideally, it should be guaranteed by the Constitution. And projects such as the European ACTA or American SOPA, as the law called Adopi in France, show that the states take a dim eye toward independence of neutrality of the net, with the pretext of a struggle against terrorism and counterfeiting. They seek to impose a control that, in fact, tends to limit both the freedom of the Internet and its neutrality. These restrictions are inadmissible, and AFT requires the search for more neutral and more freedom of expression possible on the Internet. AFT Technoprog don't accept, considering that the first lever that can facilitate a successful development of transhumanist type is education. But we insist highlight two observations. On the one hand, with all the scientific community, we warn of the dangerous slope on which commits us the continuing decline in students' numbers in science. This trend threatens the future of any society, but the consequences are not just economic. Indeed, on the other hand, our time posed to the citizens and public authorities the formidable challenge of technological convergence and acceleration. This increasing complexity of our technological environment that results from these two developments, convergence and acceleration, make that the world may be more difficult to understand. For the average citizen, the common and understandable reactions from this misunderstanding are already anxiety, fear, and sometimes may last an irrational rejection of technology. If this trend is added to the feeling, sometimes quite justified, that the political, economic interests, the media, and even the scientists themselves seek to manipulate, it's not surprising that the simple rejection is transformed in a neo-Luddite activism, that is to say, in an attempt to reduce the importance of technology. For all these reasons, AFT advocates, first of all, a very important emphasis is focused on scientific training. This must be clearly encouraged, adjusted, put in the spotlight so that their courses attract many young people. In societies where manual work may be required to be increasingly supported by automated systems, and where excellence of the economies is played on performance in the areas of knowledge, scientific training should be on the main pillars of the construction of our future. But science education at school or university does not seem sufficient to ensure at the best people's development in a transhumanist world in the making. It seems necessary to be concerned with training and invitation to reflection throughout life. Upstream, it's not enough to worry about teaching a past world throughout history, literature, or the history of philosophy, or even to a present world through science, geography, and languages, and so on. We believe it is an urgent need to teach young people and future generation to project themselves forward enough to anticipate at best the world in which they grow. For example, is it relevant to project into existence with the prospects of a life of 80 years, if it should ultimately be much longer? In other words, we propose that the transhumanist questioning is formally proposed early, at least from the middle school. Similarly, we find it necessary to open training throughout life, even that of older, to the transhumanist reflection. The generation more advanced in age will have, and have already begun, to be confronted with terrible contradictions. They grew up in a world that, if it has undergone tremendous changes throughout the 20th centuries, could be furthermore transformed by the transhumanist perspective. Not only do they have to undergo the anguish of losing their bearings, but in a society that is continually developing robotics, bionics, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, man-machine interfaces, etc., they are likely to live their turn a syndrome of lost world. They may find themselves even more helpless if appeared effective therapies addressing the, in quotes, disease of aging. But their advanced age forbade them to take full advantage. This is to prevent the consequences of such possible future shock. It seems also very important that the transhumanist thought is presented and discussed in all age groups. But since we are talking about training, it's also about preparing seniors to be able to choose to continue an activity, professional or not, well behind the current limits. Finally, to conclude on this point, let me clarify that for me, when I speak of enhancement of humanity, I can't imagine only improve our physical, cognitive or sensor-motor ability. I imagine equally improve our humanity in a quite moral term. That is to say, including enhance our ability to tolerance, compassion, and why not love. This transhumanism which I speak, so it's perhaps nothing more than a transhumanism. That is to say, the continuation of the old project of the first humanists, like Erasmus and even before him Pico della Mirandola, who said of man, it is his own judgment that will define the nature. Simply to the most exclusive use of education, some have also tried propaganda or advertising. We will gradually add the techniques of human enhancement. The last area in which the French Technoprog began to put forward some proposals is, it won't surprise you, the scientific research. I won't tire you by developing long speeches calling for more resources, more and more resources. We need more resources for education and research, of course, but I will rather focus on some specific examples. The perspectives suggested by works like those of Aubrey de Grey's Sense, those open in France by Professor Miroslav Radman at the Necker Hospital in Paris, or Jean-Marc Lemaitre in Montpellier, CNRS, INSERM, about cellular aging, suggest that an augmentation important in a first time, then behind perhaps considerable of the length of healthy life, is possible. We must therefore discuss now the possible ethical implication, but should we not also and immediately strongly support this research so that if the societal responses were positive in the end, we are able to share it as soon as possible as many? Because the longer we delay, and more for many of us, it may be too late. Apart from the financial, another dramatic factor blocking in France remains one of the outright prohibition of certain research. And I think the particular case of the study and manipulation of human embryonic stem cells. The AFT Technoprog has invested in a small way in the debate preceding the latest revision of the bioethics laws of 2011. Our analysis is that ultimately the motivation that led the previous legislature to maintain the current prohibition, with derogation possible exception, are not only concerned about an ethical propagation to avoid exploitation or commercialization of the embryo, but also about religious values, either directly or largely drawn from a Judeo-Christian source that imposes upon the living a definitive taboo. The way a part of the national representation has recently attempted to block the transition to a controlled licensing regime for these researchers is characteristic. It seems to us that the secular French Republic, more than other collectivity, cannot define its research policy on such expected. Instead, it must proclaim freedom of basic research over the whole range of living, and therefore allow those on all embryonic stem cells. The latest proposal advanced by the AFT is not the slightest. This is to make France, even more Europe, a world champion of the study and prevention of risks of NBIC convergence and possible evolution of transhumanist type. To my knowledge, if I take for example the case of nanotechnology, the share of research budgets allocated to the consideration of risks will be about 2–3% in the US and 6–7% in France. AFT Technoprog proposes to increase this proportion in the first instance to 15%. And yet, for technologies whose potential is to transform the biological condition of the human, I wonder, personally, if it will not be consistent to announce to the public, for every euro put into the research, we put a euro in the study and prevention of risk associated with this research. Sure, not rentable, you might say. In the short term, maybe. And probably should we move progressively toward this goal. But what about disaster? In case of global existential risk? It may be that the US and China begin a new kind of race for technologies of human enhancement. What will they propose to us? What will they have to offer their own citizens in the event of a major accident? The answer could come from Europe. Tomorrow, we could be alone to seeking to offer warranty to ensure the existence of humanity. So, I tried to give you an idea of what motivates the fellows of the Association Française Techno-progressive Transhumaniste Technoprog, their values and short-term goals. But I say nothing of its mode of action, but you can imagine that it's a lot on the internet. We also organize conferences, and the first four were mainly held in the Maison de la Recherche de la Sorbonne in Paris last 2 years. We also concerned to have a media presence in the newspapers, radio and TV, and you can find references at the media page of our website. You may also find that the Association Technoprog currently represents the only formal organization representing the transhumanist movement in France. It's distinguished by its techno-progressive approach that makes us pay attention to the social and existential risks. Nevertheless, it seems obvious that more and more voices are now heard here too even in the academic world, which demand a wide debate on the issues posed by transhumanism, and that many of these voices are in fact a pro-perspective of human enhancement. Simply, it's not very well seen to make his coming out and say, yes, yes, I agree with transhumanist thinking. In other words, the transhumanist current in France may well be more important than it seems. Finally, it's useful to point out that the debate on the transhumanist questioning has come upon you, since I'm honored and pleased to be invited to introduce ourselves to you today. This means that we must already begin to ask ourselves what we want to make humans and why we would do it like this or like that. From our own thoughts, on behalf of the AFT Technoprog, I have to tell you that we defend the idea of an open humanity, solidary, directed toward the free search for happiness for each and to sustainability on free conscience for all. The idea of an augmented humanity doesn't make sense if it doesn't translate into an enhancement in our condition, that as individuals and as a community. Thank you.